my sister wives that I'm leaving.
All these years, she had been careful with her words and opted to remain silent if saying something would put her at risk. But it had been eating away at her. She realized the amount of energy it took for her just to be within the family without expressing how she truly felt. All these conversations were as if they were scripted. All these reactions were as if they were filtered. And then restraint, if it becomes consistent, begins to feel like imprisonment. Christine understood that fear had been running her life for far too long. Fear of judgment, fear of disappointment, fear of being misunderstood, fear of having to alter a life that had been so carefully created over so many years. But fear had also cost her something. It had cost her her voice. And when she realized that, it couldn't be overlooked. It didn't develop out of anger against someone else. It grew out of compassion against herself. She began to ask questions she had avoided for so long. How would her life be if she never spoke again? What message would it send to her kids if it meant giving them a message that love meant silence? How would her life be in 10 years if things remained as they were? Those questions didn't put anyone on trial. They only asked her for honesty. Christine realized that silence on her part was not maintaining peace. It was delaying a confrontation. The sense of detachment that Christine had been cultivating was not diminishing. It was expanding. It was getting more and more difficult for her to conceptualize a future wherein she would be made whole again. There were times when she realized that she held back not only from the marriage, but from life itself. She began laughing less expansively. She began dreaming less ambitiously. She ceased thinking about happiness and instead thought about survival alone, and it scared her terribly. She didn't want to survive her life. She wanted to live it. That began to outweigh her fear. It was at the realization that honesty could be cruel and still be honest, and that these were not mutually exclusive things, that things truly fell apart. She had lived her entire life thus far with the notion that honesty would always be damaging. But then again, maybe it had already been, and maybe it couldn't be saved. But once that realization took hold, it never let go. Christine didn't share it with anyone right away. First, she communicated with herself. She communicated the truth, and that meant no sugarcoating it at all. She confessed that she had been lonely. She confessed that she had been emotionally deserted. She confessed that she had been scared to make these assertions because then people would get the wrong impression about her. Putting words on these feelings hurt, but it brought her back down to earth. And with that degree of internal honesty came a subtle but profound shift in her demeanor. She stood tall. She spoke forth. She ceased apologizing for feelings that didn't have to be explained. It was a subtle movement, but it could be detected, and more clearly by her kids. But they detected something different about her. Not anger, not rebellion, but clarity. Christine also began to notice that fear had clouded her understanding of her own concept of choice. She had thought that expressing her truth would ipso facto mean that everything would fall apart. But then came an awareness that she had already been living apart. Silence had not maintained oneness, but had merely postponed truth. That knowledge brought her strength, not bold strength, but enduring strength. She began to stop asking herself if it was okay that she felt as she did. She began asking herself why she ever thought it couldn't be. That is revolutionary. That put her on the path from doubting herself to respecting herself. Christine knew that when she finally spoke, it wouldn't be perfect. It wouldn't rhyme. There would be emotion. There might be confusion. But Christine knew something else as well. She knew that she could survive that. Something that Christine couldn't survive anymore, though, was betraying herself. Fear didn't end. It just ceased being the voice that dominated the room. By the time she was ready to voice it, it no longer felt like an indictment. It felt like a boundary, a pronouncement of emotional truth as opposed to a call for action. She wasn't calling on anyone to repair her wounds. She was stating them, and it made all the difference. Christine finally understood that it doesn't mean being fearless. It means being scared and choosing the truth. It means knowing your truth has value enough to be let out, no matter what it does to someone else. It means knowing your life matters more than silence.
At the threshold of that realization, Christine experienced something that she had not experienced in a very long time. Hope. Not hope that others would suddenly change. Hope that she could finally stop hiding. Finally, when Christine finally let herself speak, her words didn't flow as she had so carefully planned all these years. They were not pointed, they were not eloquent, they were soft, gentle, and downright truthful, and it was because of that they were so powerful. She didn't start with blame, she didn't start with anger, she started with admitting a truth which had been waiting for so long for her to voice. She confessed that for several years, she had been suffering from feelings of isolation, that while being around all these people and things, hearing all these words and taking part in all these activities, it sometimes made her invisible with regards to things that truly mattered to her, that it made her admit that instead of something she wanted or needed to change, it was perhaps something that needed responding instead, and it took a lot of guts just to admit that. Christine said that it took her so long to open up because she did not want to be the reason life made everyone suffer. To be blunt, it broke my heart. But what Christine had yet to learn about her silence was just how much it had cost her. She had been contracting herself emotionally to fit into a space that never grew larger to accommodate her. As she spoke, she finally let herself acknowledge something that she had been denying for years, that wanting a sense of emotional security and stability and loving affection didn't make her weak, it made her human, and it terrified her because it meant that she had been living with these things for too long. There was silence after her words, not because people didn't care, but because they were grappling with something they had never fully witnessed before. Christine was not presenting a list of complaints. She was laying bare an internal life that had existed side by side with the life they led. She spoke about the guilt she felt for even thinking that way, about how she questioned herself on a constant basis, about how she wondered if maybe she was asking for too much, when in fact she knew that she was asking for very little. She confessed that for years she had been reminding herself that everything would be fine if she just waited a bit longer, but they never did. What made this admission so hard was that it wasn't about a single instance or an argument, it was about a pattern of slowly losing emotional intimacy that she no longer could neglect. It's not about being scared to fight, she said. It's about being scared to see that my life, the life I've been fighting so hard to maintain, is literally taking everything out of me. Her children listened as if they absorbed every word. They didn't appear shocked, they didn't appear confused. They looked like people who finally understood something they had felt but never had words for. Christine recognized it in their eyes, a recognition of the quiet sorrow they had noticed all these years, a recognition of the weight of emotions that she had been trying so hard to hide, that recognition that their mother had been carrying so much more than what they had ever known. It was the first time Christine didn't have an overwhelming sense that she needed to explain herself, that she didn't have to explain her feelings, that she didn't have to cushion her truth so that it might be more warmly received. Just saying it, to put it out there, was enough. I'm scared to say all these things because I know once I say them, I won't be able to pretend anymore that everything is okay. The truth would change how my family looks at me, it would change how I look at myself, and it would change what happens next. But covering it up had already altered her. It had made her quieter, more cautious, even more removed from what she once was, and she could no longer live that way. Christine didn't want anyone to repair her hurt. She wasn't demanding an immediate solution. She was doing something exponentially more valuable. She was accepting her emotional truth and making no effort to deny it anymore. It took a tremendous amount of strength for her just to do that. It was not so surprising that people were watching her. It had been that way her whole life. That caught her off guard, the sense of peace that followed. It had been an expectation that things would be crazy, that there would be fighting. But instead, there was a sense of perspective. Finding her voice didn't shatter her. It centered her. It put words to feelings that had been amorphous for. She understood that the thing which she had been most afraid to utter had been precisely what she had most needed to say. I haven't really felt emotionally fulfilled for a very long time. Those were not accusatory words. They didn't rewrite history. They were only labeling her reality. And naming it changed everything. After the words were finally spoken, Christine didn't feel that rush of relief that she had once imagined would occur with honesty. But what Christine instead experienced was something quieter and more profound. It was a sense of alignment. It had been several years before Christine realized that for the first time in her life, her feelings on the inside were finally matched with her feelings on the outside. Although the fear that had silenced her before had not disappeared overnight, it no longer ruled her. It tempered. It relaxed its hold on her, and instead a sense of constant calm settled within her, and it came from knowing that she had ceased betraying herself. She no longer had to prepare conversations in her mind, or weigh every word before speaking. She no longer had to shelter a reality that had never truly sheltered her.
Christine had words lurking just beneath the surface of her voice, words that she had been thinking about and replaying in her mind but never letting out. These weren't life-changing words, not words that would shake someone's foundation or make them rethink everything they thought they knew. These were more subtle, weightier, the sort that might alter the ways people looked at her, altering the family dynamic and the life she had lived for so long. Christine had always been recognized as the emotional backbone of the family, the one who brought light into a room full of people, the one who made an effort to keep things lively when the air was thick with tension, the one who showed that if she remained hopeful enough, patient enough, loving enough, then eventually all would be balanced. It didn't have anything to do with obligation, but it had everything to do with hope. She sincerely felt that love could be maintained by endurance, that sacrifice was a factor in commitment, and that her feelings could wait for the larger picture. Feelings don't just evaporate because we want them to wait. But with time, Christine figured out ways to smile despite carrying with her the weight of disappointment, to nod her head in understanding as the conversations were taking place, but still made her feel as if no one could see her, to swallow back her words when something inside screamed that something was wrong. At first, it was with the conviction that it's but a phase, that every family goes through a tough period, that what she's feeling doesn't have to be dealt with immediately. Those seasons soon turned into years. But with every passing year, these feelings were outweighed by fear, not because she didn't know what she wanted, but because she knew exactly how vulnerable it would make her should she voice it. To acknowledge her truth meant acknowledging there was something missing. It meant understanding that for her, love had never been a concrete thing. Christine isn't scared of an argument. She's lived with enough tension to know that she can endure it. It's something much more fundamental that Christine is afraid of. It's being misunderstood. It's being told that her feelings are wrong. It's being labeled as ungrateful for wanting more out of life than what she's getting. And maybe, just maybe, it's knowing that once the words are spoken, they can't be unsaid. So she kept quiet. She turned her focus on her kids. She worked hard at making a home that made them feel safe and loved, even as her own needs were not being met. She reminded herself that as long as they were all right, she would be fine. She reminded herself that it was her job to hold everything together, not to tear it apart with uncomfortable truths. However, there were consequences for the silence. It manifested itself first in small ways, a fatigue that didn't have an earthly reason, an irritability and sorrow that hung around longer than it should have, an inability to genuinely feel happy. All of these things began to make Christine feel as if she were living outside of her life, as if she were living on automatic while committed to a life. There were nights when the words that scared her to admit were loud in her mind. She would rewind conversations thinking about how things might be different if she were more honest. She would try to picture saying what she really wanted to say, and then picture what might happen next. The disappointment, the confusion, the risk that she might be told she was asking for too much. So, silence again. Christine repeated to herself that silence was an act of love, a manifestation of loyalty, a sign of mature behavior. And it worked. It worked for a very, very long time. But endurance without emotional fulfillment will eventually lead to isolation. And isolation, if untreated, leads to pain. The hardest thing about it was that on appearances, everything seemed to be working. The family kept on, so did life. It seemed as if everyone assumed that if Christine isn't making her voice heard, then things must be fine for her. But silence does not necessarily equal happiness, and Christine was anything but happy. She began to see that what she was most afraid to admit wasn't just about her marriage. It was about her. It was about admitting that she had been shortchanging her own needs for so long that she no longer recognized them. It was about admitting that she had been scared to want more, because to want more meant wanting something other than what she already had. And this truth seemed dangerous. Christine didn't want to be the one who rocked the boat. She wanted to be the one who made life easy for everyone. She didn't want pain. So she chose to bear her fear with dignity and silence, thinking it would be the softer option. Yet, beneath it all, a question began to emerge. It began gently and grew louder with passing time. But what if not saying anything was causing her more pain than anything I could ever express with words? This question followed her everywhere, from family events, from private moments, from conversations in which she almost revealed something genuine and then caught herself at the very end. The fear was a constant presence, but so was the truth she contained within. And so, slowly, Christine began to grasp something that had been kept at bay for so long. Fear of saying it didn't make it any less true. It meant it counted. By the time she reached this realization, the silence on which she had depended no longer seemed so protective. It was choking. Christine's fear was not based on weakness. It was based on knowledge. She knew exactly what telling her truth would mean, because she had been observing for a long time just how emotions were treated within her family.
She knew which feelings were encouraged and welcomed, and which ones were carefully set aside, and her own truth very clearly fit into the latter bucket. As much as she wanted to, she could not voice it, because saying it meant admitting that love, for her, had been uncertain for a while. It was not an easy thing to admit within a family founded on commitment, on faith, and on public vows. Christine feared that if she confessed what she really wanted, it would sound as if she were a failure. Not just a personal failure, but the failure of an entire life that she had fought for so long. It had taken her so long to reassure herself and everyone else that it would work, that love would extend, and that waiting would be worth it. She worried about being judged, even by people who loved her. She worried they might wonder why she remained if she was unhappy. She worried they might question why she waited before speaking out. She worried they would then be saying that her pain was something she should have tolerated more effectively, something she should have dealt with more discreetly, something they could have processed more graciously. Christine was also worried about the effects it would have on her kids. She had always made it a point to protect them from the pain that adults suffer. She didn't want them to be torn between loyalty and truth. She didn't want them to shoulder the burden that they shouldn't have. She thought that if she remained silent, it would help her kids maintain some sense of stability. But what she failed to understand for a very long time was that kids don't need silence to be assured. Nevertheless, fear isn't rational. It doesn't offer itself readily to reassurances. And with every instance that Christine almost spoke out but caught herself, her fear intensified. And there were times, private moments, brief moments, when the truth almost escaped. In conversations that were too long, in an argument that hit too close to home, in moments of heavy silence that were more weighty than words. But every time she suppressed it, she reminded herself it wasn't the right moment, that things were already complicated enough, that opening her mouth would make it all worse. So she waited, and waiting became a habit. The longer she kept quiet, the more difficult it became for her to conceive of breaking her silence. It didn't remain static either. It changed. It grew. It developed undertones of aggravation and sorrow and a hint of loss that she couldn't quite articulate. She was no longer worried about saying something. She was worried about saying something and thus opening doors to all that had accumulated on the other side. Christine also had a fear of being misunderstood. She knew that people would misunderstand her as asking for perfection instead of presence. She would be understood as rejecting her family instead of her grief for something that she never had within her family. She would be listened to someone who criticized instead of someone who yearned. The longing for acceptance, longing for feelings of security, longing for the approval and acceptance that make them. Those needs are vulnerable. Vulnerability necessitates trust. To begin with, for a considerable period, Christine had reservations about receiving trust should she open up. There was also the fear of permanence. She knew that once certain words were said, things could never be as they were before. Even if things didn't change for a period, it would be remembered. It would be as if a stone had been turned over. It would be as if a door had been unlocked. She was afraid that telling the truth would start something that would be out of her control. Thus, she chose to remain silent and deal with the issue from within. Yet pain doesn't fade away once it begins to be controlled. It merely changes form. Christine began to feel as if she were disconnected not only from her marriage but from herself, as if she were doubting her own reactions, downplaying her own feelings, asking herself if she were being too sensitive, too emotional, too demanding. It's perhaps the most damaging thing about her silence, because it leads her to question her own emotional truth. She reminded herself that it meant she wasn't grateful enough, that it meant she wasn't trying hard enough, that it meant she wasn't faithful enough to the values that she once clung to so tightly, and with every thought, her truth slipped farther beneath. Fear became familiar, but safety and familiarity are not synonymous. But there were also moments when Christine understood that her silence was transforming her. She realized that she had become very guarded with people, that her words had become carefully measured, that she had begun to censor herself before talking about even innocuous things, that instead of just concealing her truth, she had begun to hide herself. That filled her with more fear than the prospect of public speaking, because losing yourself occurs quietly. It occurs when you put peace ahead of truth again and again. It occurs when you put more importance on harmony than your feelings. It occurs when fear becomes your decision maker for a prolonged period, and you are no longer aware of what it is like to be a person with courage. Christine didn't want to be that sort of person, but fear doesn't let go so easily. It clutches tighter with every sign of change, and as her discomfort becomes more and more difficult to turn a blind eye to, so too does her fear. It whispers that expressing herself would make her selfish, would make her difficult, would make her the problem. So she kept quiet, until she couldn't anymore. Because fear, if it stays with you for too long, loses its potency. Not immediately, but gradually. It loses strength with exhaustion, and Christine was exhausted. Mentally, physically, and spiritually. She was tired of carrying words that were getting heavier with every passing year. She was tired of sheltering everyone around her, at her own cost. The fear was still there, but it was no longer stronger than her need to be honest,